Good evening to all of you, and welcome to the Sheila Johnson Design Center. I'm Radhika Subramaniam, and I'm the Director and Chief Curator of the SJDC, and very delighted this evening to welcome you and to be collaborating with a good friend and ally in the institution, Ashok Gurung of the India-China Institute, and with Gina Drew. When we started speaking about this event, it was because at the Sheila Johnson Design Center, we are focusing this fall on climate change and brought an exhibition from the UK dealing with 25 artists who are responding to issues of climate change. And we built out a fairly substantial program to think about the role of the imagination in this issue. And I was very happy to have, not only for purely parochial reasons, owing to my own affiliations, very pleased to have a representation and a very substantial discussion with people whose work I very much admire and I'm very interested in. So I want to turn this over to Ashok, who I think will make the introductions of everyone, and to welcome all of you and all our speakers tonight. Thank you.
Well, good evening. First of all, I would like to welcome all of you to this wonderful gathering, especially on Friday evening. And I suspect many of you probably were out supporting the Occupy the Wall Street movement. So people have been working very hard lately, even after office hours, school work. So this is not easy to commit Friday evening to this program. So I want to thank you all. I want to thank Radhika and the Sheila Johnson Design Center for collaborating on this program because it really in some ways allows us to frame the conversation in a broader context. So for that, I'm really grateful that Radhika was very generous with her time and also ideas of convening this conversation. Special thanks to 4 friends who happen to be very respected, highly accomplished scholars and experts in their respective fields. It's very unusual to have a person from China, a person from Pakistan, a person from Nepal, and a person from India. That too of their caliber in same room. So we are delighted that they made this journey to be with us today. Thanks also to my staff, Grace Ho, Ryan. I don't know, Ryan is here. Several other research assistants, but most importantly, Gina Drew. Gina is a colleague. She is actually the coordinator and research person responsible for everyday religion and sustainable environments in the Himalaya initiative at India-China Institute at the New School. So thank you, Gina, for really putting this thing together with Radhika. Okay, who else? Anyone else I'm missing in terms of thanking? Okay, so briefly, I think about the how this particular conversation fits within the larger India-China conversation. For us, I think climate change is, of course, as we all know, is probably going to be one of the most defining issue of the 21st century. So for that, reason alone, I think I'm sure many of you are here. But I think climate change together with Himalayas, and when you frame it, within India-China context, for us it becomes very interesting. One is we at the institute, at India-China Institute, we are interested in learning about, engaging with the re-emergence of India-China story that most of you know about. But what happens is most of what you know about India-China often comes from what we call Beijing-centric or Delhi-centric perspective. Pretty much keeping in, with the tradition of new school thinking outside the box, we have made a deliberate effort to look at India-China story from the margins, That means what's happening at the margins, whether it's Southwest China, whether it's really Northeast India. So in that regard, focusing on the Himalaya and looking at Himalaya as well as India-China story allows us to really look at India-China story in a much more interesting and nuanced and useful ways. So for that reason, when you think about climate change, when you think about water issues, the whole, whether it's Pearl River Delta, whether it's West Bengal or Sundarbans, they all in some ways begin to connect to the Himalayas in ways that most people often do not think of. So for us, having this particular program allows us to connect with the story of climate change on one hand, but also the reemergence of India-China story. For that reason, I'm really delighted that we could convene this conversation today. Everyone, I think, received a brief flyer. I won't really, go in detail telling you about the 4 speakers because I think you can read this information, except to tell you that Sanjay Chaturvedi, who will be speaking first. Sanjay is he's a professor of political science at Punjab University and happens to be also a fellow of India-China Institute. Someone that I have, become good friends with, someone that I have come to really respect for both his really knowledge that goes all the way from 2 Arctic regions to the so-called the third pole, Himalayas. So I'm really delighted that he made this journey, and he's going to share his thoughts on the topic today, which, as you all know, is rethinking everyday religion and climate change in the Himalayas. After Sanjay's remarks, Anil Chitrakar is going to speak. And Anil is someone known to someone who is really known for his many talents. And among many talents, he is really someone who inspires the so-called leaders, and he's leaders' leader. When it comes to climate change story, people in Nepal obviously look up to him, but also many people from the region, including Central Asia, have been seeking his guidance because of his unique perspective. Who is trained as an engineer, but also looks at energy issues, and now really delves into the both public aspect of climate change story as well as scientific discourse that is unfolding. Then we have Faiz Ali Khan. Faiz is the National Director for Programs for Mountain Areas Conservation and with the Ministry of Disaster Management in Islamabad. He has extensive experience working in that part of the world, both working with the communities as well as with government and multilateral organizations. Talking to him in the past day or so, I'm amazed, the amount of work and the extensive networks that they have on the ground, as well as, people who are dealing from a very macro perspective. So I'm really delighted that, Faiz Ali Khan can join us today. Then, last but not the least, a very good friend, Libo. Libo is he is the director of Friends of Nature, which is the largest and oldest and perhaps the most respected environmental organization in China. He is someone, again, who is someone who knows the debates on environmental front, but knows it from the perspective that many Chinese environmental, scholars and experts often miss out, which is that he is deeply grounded in the in the local communities. He's someone who, when he returned from finishing his graduate studies at Cornell, instead of looking for jobs in Beijing or Shanghai, actually spent several years in rural parts of China, and really in the process he brings a very unique perspective to this particular conversation today. and he was also the fellow of India-China Institute. So on that note, one more thing I wanted to mention. As part of Everyday Religion and Sustainable Environments in the Himalayas initiative, it's an initiative that is funded by Luce Foundation. And it basically is an interesting exercise where we have a group of about 40 plus scholars and experts from India, China, Nepal, Bhutan, and now Pakistan, who are really looking at the new dimensions, cultural dimensions of understanding notions surrounding sustainability, notions surrounding how do people on everyday basis really conceptualize and practice various notions of sustainability, and to what extent various religious traditions shape the way people think, the way people contest, the way people negotiate ideas surrounding sustainable living in a broader sense of the word. So with that, now what I'll do is I'll request Sanjay to first, share his thoughts, followed by 3 others. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ashok. Good evening, everyone. I'm very grateful to you, Ashok, to India-China Institute, very grateful to Sheila Johnson Center and its director, Radhika Subramaniam. And I'm also very grateful to all of you sitting here this evening for giving me the opportunity to share some of my thoughts in progress on a subject which I find extremely interesting and intriguing. Come as I do from the foothills of Himalayas, I spent my early childhood in Himachal Pradesh and also did my graduation from there. I have been looking at the discourses, unfolding discourses of climate change. And my central argument this evening is that both climate change and the Himalayas are not simply about physicalities, but they are also about imaginations, visualizations, and representations. And I think this is what makes the climate change Himalaya interface so interesting and so fascinating. I also want to argue and illustrate in the course of my presentation that there is a very complex spatial imaginative geography to climate change. And what I want to focus in my presentation is this interplay between what I would like to describe as the sacred geographies of Himalayas. And let me say that I'm not assuming even for a moment that the meaning of the word sacred is settled. In fact, I will try to argue that it is highly contested. At the same time, there is this profane, or these are profane geographies of the climate change meta-narrative. And these meta-narratives are driven by Earth climate science. And what we see in Himalayas, which can be also visualized as a region of regions or as a space of diverse places, is this very interesting interplay between the sacred and the profane. This particular projection of Himalayas, in a way, is revealing, but at the same time, it is misleading because it gives us the impression as if Himalayas are disconnected from the rest of the globe, which they are not. If we are looking at the first pole, which is Arctic, or the second pole, Antarctica, or the third pole, Himalayas, it is possible to argue that all the 3 poles today are very much impacted by the transformations and transitions which are taking place in the larger international system. At the same time, it is possible to argue that Himalayas themselves are a witness to a series of transitions and transformations. Climate is changing, but climate is not the only thing that is changing. Now, this particular map of Himalayas, again, is very interesting. It shows you elevation, it shows you urban extent, it shows you a number of other features, including glaciers. But of course, what it does not show is the diversity of human and cultural geographies, and the fact that many of these geographies are being seen and perceived as sacred by the communities concerned. We are not really talking about a free-floating kind of a conceptualization of communities in the Himalayas, but we are talking about communities which are embedded in their respective localities. Now, let me draw your attention very quickly to what I would like to describe as the profane geographies of Earth climate science. And here my reference is to IPCC and the politics of knowledge. Very briefly, I would just make a very quick reference to the Himalayan blunder that IPCC committed when it said, I quote, that glaciers in the Himalayas are receding faster than in any part of the world, and if the present rate continues, the likelihood of them disappearing by the year 2035, and perhaps sooner, is very high. If the Earth keeps warming at the current rate, its total area will likely shrink from the present 500,000 to 100,000 square kilometers by the year 2035. Of course, this mistake was then later on rectified by the IPCC. A formal apology was rendered. But I think in this entire omission, and then of course the later acknowledgement, there is a fact, which is that the IPCC, or the geographies that we find being propagated by the IPCC, do not take into account the fact that these geographies are lived-in geographies as well. Now, just to give you one example, IPCC talks about the retreat of the Gangotri Glacier. And then, of course, later on, the IPCC acknowledged that some of his findings, particularly the finding that by 2035 these glaciers are going to melt, was wrong. Now, the point that is missing here is that this is not simply a glacier. It is not the physicality of the glacier, but it is also a sacred geography, because what you see by the side of it is the temple, which is the Gangotri Dham, and Ganga, which is one of the most holy rivers for the Hindus in South Asia. It originates from here. And as Faz will later on show you in his presentation, there are also communities, which have a very close organic relationship and whose livelihoods are dependent on these water resources. This map is also very interesting because what we see is that the profane geographies of earth science, climate science, have also led to a climate of fear. Because if you look at these rivers that zigzag the Himalayan space, then I think it is important to bear in mind that the IPCC findings, particularly some of the alarmist findings, can lead to a great deal of tension and conflict over the sharing of river waters. Now, this is one very interesting visualization and representation of the Himalayan eco-region complex, which comes from WWF. And as you will see, that this is what is described as the sacred Himalayas. And if you look at the larger projection of the eco-regions, then you see that these sacred spaces are embedded within the larger eco-regions of the Himalaya. Sometimes it is forgotten that Himalayas also have a very close ecological link with the Bay of Bengal. And I think what I'm trying to argue here is quite in support of what I said earlier, that it's wrong to look at Himalayas in isolation. There are very profound and deep ecological linkages as we see some of the Himalayan rivers draining into the Bay of Bengal and sustaining one of the largest contiguous mangrove forests in the world. Now that brings me to my second major argument, which is that we need to look at the Himalayan geographies in terms of contested sacred geographies. Now, to give you just one example, this is where we have a very interesting mental map of the sacred geographies of the Himalayas. It shows sacred peaks, it shows various sacred groves where you can see temples, and it is also important to bear in mind that these sacred geographies are also a part of the imaginations of, for example, the right-wing Hindu nationalist parties, where the central Himalayas have also been mapped by the Hindutva, which is the Hindu cultural nationalism, in terms of a very different notion of sacred and sacredness. But the sacred with which I am concerned in my presentation is not the sacredness of Hindu cultural nationalism, but it is the sacredness of everyday religions which are embedded in certain localities and which are nature-driven, nature-informed, and which are also culture-informed and culture-driven. Now, I give you just two examples very quickly to show as to how the notion of sacred is being deployed. Now, one example is that of Badrivan. This is the ancient sacred forest of the Badrinath shrine, which is one of the oldest shrines. You find mention of this shrine even in the Hindu epics. Now, what happens in the story is that, as you see in slide number 1, this is where we found there was a large-scale deforestation as a result of a long-standing history of ecologically unsustainable development in this part of the Himalaya. And then a brilliant idea struck those who were in government that they can probably use the social, cultural, religious symbols and resources to go for a reforestation program. And this is what they did. They set up a small eco-laboratory. They distributed seedlings, as a sort of holy prasadam, as we call it. Communities were involved. The religious authorities of the local priests were being invoked. And the result was success. They could go for a large-scale reforestation program. Now, from one perspective, one can say that this has been a success story. But on the other hand, it is possible to argue that this kind of a approach is the approach of mitigation, where you use the sacred resources to mitigate climate change. I am more interested in the deployment of the sacred, and sacred as lived-in geographies, for climate change adaptation. And that brings me to the sacred groves of the Himalayas. From the same part of Himalaya, where I showed you the earlier example, you have these sacred groves, these sacred patches of forests. Now, this is where the entire concept of space and scale is turned upside down. The conventional geographical scale does not really work here, because what we are talking about here are not the visible geographies, or the external geographies, but internalized socio-spatial consciousness of the communities concerned, which has been long-standing, which has withstood the tests of times. Now, if you look at the sacred groves of the central Himalayas, then you are looking at all these icons. You are looking at a very fascinating iconography, which again, as I said, is embedded in localities and in a deep-rooted historical, socio-spatial consciousness. And I think it is at this level, and that is my argument as I conclude, it is at this level that some of the most complex struggles for adaptation to climate change are going to take place. These sacred groves are the rich storehouses of biodiversity, medicinal plants. These are also the sites where one could map out and fruitfully tap into local indigenous knowledge systems and local wisdoms. And these are the sacred groves about which we really do not know much when it comes to, for example, Garhwal part of the Himalayas. So much more interdisciplinary research is needed on these sacred groves. And the tragedy of the local commons, as I would like to describe it, is that these sacred groves are disappearing at a very fast pace as a result of a host of factors, which includes tourism, urbanization, deforestation, animal grazing, human interferences. So this very rich social institution, this is how I would like to describe the sacred groves of Himalayas, as sacred institutions seem to be appearing very fast. And I conclude by showing this particular cartoon, and I think it is more than a cartoon, where there is a very interesting conversation between two, that is, how can a nature lover like me tolerate your standing in the sun and rain? You are welcome to the decorated showcase in my AC room. And the tree's response is, you want me to become a bonsai like you. And I think there is some hidden, very important message here, and I would like to conclude on that particular note. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, I think, the idea of 4 speakers So the point is not to repeat, anything. And so we had a nice cup of coffee, and we just said we'd build on each other's presentation. So what I would like to really do is, take you to Nepal. And so this might look like a gruesome picture. For some, it might look like a very romantic, festival. But, when we talk about everyday religion, for example, in the month of October, we have a festival when every, all male goats, actually get slaughtered. Now, it's terrible, right? But also look at right, and look at this, animalrightsnepal.org. The picture is there. Now, the point is, right, when we talked about the geography, when we talked about the ecosystem, just remember that the people in the Himalayas, live off the land. And just try to imagine this. We think they're all agrarian or they're all survive on agriculture. But the reality is that in the Himalayas, as you go north, it takes about 9 months for one crop to ripen. And so the ecosystem, or the fact that people have been living there for thousands of years, is because agriculture is combined with livestock grazing, and the livestock is supplemented with trade. So any household has its income from trade, from grazing, and from agriculture. So it's a really nice combination by which they're able to survive. Now, the point being, if we do not slaughter the goats, the goat population will rise to a level where the Himalayas could actually also degrade. Now, in management, right, in terms of management, just if you use the word culling, versus slaughtering, right? So culling becomes a management tool. And so what we really have to understand is that if you do not, manage the numbers, it can also cause, problems. So can you then really, have a conversation where, and I can understand the sentiments, you don't justify it, but try to understand it. How or why are we able to actually maintain those levels? Now, the second thing is you'll also understand that as the animals graze, this has become one of the greatest tools for biodiversity conservation. These weeds, these grasses that the animals survive on is actually the only way you can prevent, invasive species from actually, basically, wiping out sort of the indigenous, plants. So the point is it's complex. And the point is it is worth, looking at. But the point also is that we don't have all the answers, and yet we have to understand that, this is part of everyday life, up in the Himalayas. So these get, quite complex. Now, this is just a simple, intervention. So, for example, these families, before they went into solar lighting, would use kerosene. And so kerosene lights were the only way that they could have clean light in the home. Now, we've replaced that with, a solar system. The point being that this solar light, not only gives you clean light, but also it plays the radio. But then we've tweaked the system in such a way that it also charges a mobile phone. So imagine in a country like Nepal today, 1 in 3 Nepalese actually carries a mobile phone today. And so suddenly, because there is connectivity, you're able to do a lot more, because you can actually do weather reports, you can do seeds, you can do disaster prevention work, all of these things happen. But the point again to link with climate is to really understand that some of these technologies, some of these interventions have actually come about because people are concerned with climate issues. Okay? So now let's look at a picture like this, right? This is again just a few weeks ago, and this is when the Kathmandu Valley people, we celebrate a day when we cleanse our own body. And so the human body itself is sacred. And so what we eat, what we do, how we behave, all become part of that everyday religion. Now, the reason I put this slide up is for you to understand that in a society where everything is sacred, from the human body to water, and water being one of those most sacred things, 25 years ago, when we tried to generate power from water, the local people would actually come up to you and say, once you remove energy from the water, will the rice still grow? Now, I'm not saying people are superstitious. I'm not saying people are way backward or things like that. But when you intervene, when you work with these communities, you really have to understand and value how they look at their environment. So it's not as simple as just going there and putting a turbine and then electrifying the village. You really have to sit with them, explain to them that you're not causing any damage, right? That the water is still sacred and we're just using a part of it. So it's this kind of conversations that sometimes we never think of, but we need to think of. So the success of a project or the success of an intervention could actually succeed or fail because we do not have understandings of those local values. Now, just a simple example. This is a nice solar cooker, and everybody thought that this is a wonderful technology. When we tried to introduce this across the Himalayas, we found that people didn't adopt it. And the reason was very simple. Most people in the Himalayas, they go to work at 4:30 or 5 in the morning before the sun comes up. So it is not because the technology is not good, it's because it doesn't fit with the life cycle of those people. And so the other thing, which was also very interesting, was that, the solar cooker is good for boiling, but everybody in the Himalayas loves fried food. So fried mustard leaves or fried spinach. And so it's not a very good, for frying, right? So it fails. But the third point, which is also interesting, again, linking with culture, is that in many homes, they did not adopt the solar cooker because they would not cook outside. It's a very funny value where you think, I am poor, I eat certain things, but why should my neighbor know what I cook? And so these values, these little subtle things, are the ones that actually make these things fail. I'm sure many of you know of this example of, trying to introduce steel plows in Africa. And so, basically, they try to introduce these steel things, and nobody would use it because it was cutting Mother Earth. And so simple, values, but we really have to understand, these things. Now, while the goats get slaughtered, these are also places where dogs get worshipped. Right? And so this is, again, just a few weeks ago when all the dogs, in Nepal get their dog's day, literally. And so they get worshipped. And so, again, while some animals, are okay for slaughtering, some are actually, for worshipping. So just trying to understand, how these things work. Now look at this, little intervention here. So this is a biogas or a methane, gas plant. Okay. So again, if you think of buffalo or cow manure, it is sacred. And so it is okay to put into this digester to actually generate methane gas, and it's okay for cooking. But it took a certain price level for the butane, cooking gases to reach, so that we could actually encourage people to connect their own toilets to these plants. Now, human waste, is bad. Cow waste is good, right? But now, increasingly with market forces and the price of butane going up, you can see that almost every villager now is connecting their toilet and their animal waste into these plants to generate manure. Now, what is happening across Nepal is that you can actually find the cleanest villages, not because of knowledge about bacteria or about viruses, but because the cooking gas is so expensive that they're beginning to mix the sacred manure with the not so sacred manure. So just to understand these little things, right? Just one other aspect, and so we can pass this on, is you see those wicks on the mat. So it's really interesting how people in terms of their perseverance they weave these wicks. And so just when you get to 100,000 of those little wicks, guess what? They all put it together and burn it. And so this constant reminder that we are all impermanent and that, we will get destroyed. And so this whole thing's about, values, about how impermanent we all are and how we have to survive in this ecosystem and how fragile, everything is. And so it's this kind of values that you can really nurture if you want to move, ahead with these issues. So just to conclude, climate sounds like a big issue. It sounds like something that is extremely complex. But then sometimes you really have to go on the ground, be with the people and try to look at those issues from their perspective. And I think, this whole initiative, which is bringing all these things together and also studying it and trying to understand it from different aspects will actually give us a lot of new ways, to tackle it. I think the last word would be change is certain, right? The speed of change makes people very vulnerable. And so we really have to understand how we can prepare them, for that change. And so you can use the word resilience. You can use the word adaptation. You can use, all kinds of words, but really is the human variable, that we really have to, understand very well. Okay. On that note, can I ask Libor to continue?
Thank you. So we have moved from the other side of the Himalaya to this side of the Himalaya. But to me, Himalaya is rather symbolic. 90% of the Chinese population, which is 1.3 billion, 70% of it live along the coastal area of China, whereas 70% of the landmass is regarded western, backward, remote area, which is not necessarily very close to Himalaya, but that's what I call it. It's the remote less developed region. So when we talk about climate change, oftentimes in China, we talk about scientific inventions, technological solutions in the urbanized China. China used to be an agrarian society. Probably 20% of the population are regarded urban, but now nearly 50% of the population are regarded urban. So the way of life are really changing very fast. And when we just focus on technological inventions and solutions, we probably miss a lot. So moving to the large landmass in the West, I'm hoping to learn how everyday religion has a story to tell to the people. The majority of people live in the coastal area. And particularly from the waste and the pollution perspective, as resources are traveling from the high ground to the low ground, and a lot of less polluting technologies are actually moving upstream, and also the urbanization is moving upstream. So waste is very much a focus of climate change in China, just because the urbanization rate is so fast, and how people produce waste. There is a saying, we are what we eat. Maybe we need to change, we are what we litter. And we are how we turn resources into waste, and also how we suffer from the waste pollution. If there is a chance for us to turn waste into vicious cycle of waste into circular economy, maybe there is a better chance. This is the kind of area I worked for 6 or 7 years in southwest China. The southeastern corner of Tibetan area in Yunnan province. As you can see, the system, the nature system is still pristine. But let's largely look at the area in the red circle. This is regarded a global significance of biodiversity conservation, which is largely consists of Yunnan, part of Sichuan, and part of Tibet, and very small part of Guizhou. And there have been people studying different ethnic groups in this region, and this much area, in the total area of biodiversity is, there are sacred land practices of several different minorities. So in this everyday religion study, I plan to focus on this very small area in that blue circle, a blue square. The local people call it Gaotang, or Zhongdian is the Chinese name, and recently it renamed itself Shangri-La County. And so I'm going to study the town, the urbanization process, and also the waste pollution in the adjacent wetland area. Back in 2003, there have been a big heated debate about where is Shangri-La County. Many places have, come up with their fairy tales where it should be, and Zhongdian, or the Gaotang County government, successfully convinced the central government to name this place Shangri-La County. It's quite a saga how this happened, and you can see the ceremony, and the central thing is the harmony and peace between nature and people, and the development. But since 2003, we have seen so much development going on in this town. First of all, they changed the old style, as you can see from this picture, where they use the toilet tile. They peeled off the toilet tile to very boring buildings and put it Tibetan style, and then they build those new hotels like that one. There are a lot of them, and so there is a very fast development, a lot of investment coming in, like mining, tourism, that are coming in. So there is a urbanization process and a commercialization process, and what is also happening is there is a higher environment risk. I'm going to focus on the study in this town, as you can see from there. This town was pretty much deserted back in the 1990s because a lot of people have moved out of the town because there is little service. But this town has a long history. It's on the ancient trade route of tea and horse, or the Southern Silk Road. But after the county was renamed Shangri-La, the outsiders started to come in, and they started to rent the place, and they started to, open a lot of shops in this old town. And this big copper Tibetan style monastery is renovated, and also this one, you see that the yellow lights were added. So the whole movement of making this place a tourist attraction. And the old buildings, the wood building, that building is supposed to be more than 100 years old, and nobody would appreciate it, but the tourism sort of give it a new identity, and people start to appreciate the old buildings. So you see the tensions between the locals and outsiders, and the new interest on tourism, conservation, mining, and the reborn of old town and its identity. Everything mixed together. And how do we understand local people's practice of religion in this all changes? That would be a question to ask. In this town, there is a very important lake. And every year it gets flooded, and also the water retreat, and that's when in the winter time, the black-necked crane arrive here as a wintering ground, and they need water because there are enough fish to grow so that they can survive. But because the town is developing, so the sewage system, the wastewater started to come into the lake, and the water gets polluted. So the fish get poisoned. The black-necked crane doesn't have enough to eat. So you see the urbanization and the waste treatment start to really impact the ecosystem of the wetland. The new wave of conservation, the environmentalists also arrived. They view this as a beautiful ecosystem, but less they recognize there are a lot of people also live here. I just want to give you an example how the value system or the priorities have been changing. This is a plant that looks very beautiful. Photographers, tourists really like the landscape like this. But the traditional practice of the herders is to get rid of them every year. But the tourists start to come. The tourism bureau start to tell the herders, you can get more money from keeping those plants than herding the animals. And this is actually poisonous to the yak. But more and more you see rangeland become very beautiful, but they become less productive. So that's how the nature start to change. This is very much thought in progress. My part of the research is really to understand how historical and the present perception of waste and pollution is formulated, and how everyday religion is practiced and also how the outside changes have impact on it. So I'm trying to record and understand the changes and the difference between the current system and the traditional system. At the same time, I want to understand how people of different values, the relationship with nature, will come into play in the local sustainability and environment safety. This picture, I would like to end with this picture. This was an idea when I was working in the village. The villagers wanted to, every family has a family picture. But one evening when we have meetings, the villagers said, we have a lot of argument and we disagree, and when outsiders come to rent our land, and we always suspect each other, and we are very fearful of changes. And in spirit of solidarity, they said, let's make a picture of the whole villages, and each family will take a picture, and then we put them together to show that we are, together, and we have to live together in this place. So we, basically invited a photographer and took pictures of the family and put it together in the village, and that start to really. It's such a very important moment, because a lot of people since they have passed away, and they return to this picture to look for their members, their memories. So how do we, in this phase of changes, trying to create something that the local people can still hold together? And I believe everyday religion has a very important role to play, both as content and also as a form for them. So I'm going to end here. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm just giving you a quick tour of Western Himalaya, where the Himalaya starts its journey, 625 kilometers up north from Islamabad. And this is a picture taken at the nearby the confluence of the mountains, Karakoram, Himalaya, and Hindu Kush meets. We all know, it has been said about the Himalaya, and people around the globe, they know Himalaya about just because of 2 points, that it's a very good hotspot for biodiversity, the species richness, and the species of critical status, snow leopard, plants and medicinal herbs. Secondly, people also know Himalaya with regard to the civilization, the culture, ethnicity, the practices, indigenous knowledge. But very few people know about the actual relation of the people with the environment. And Sanjay mentioned in his presentation the community, the relation of the communities with the environment. And if you see the picture in the middle, this is actually the whole community is there because of the water source coming from the Himalaya. People in the Western Himalaya followed Islam, Buddhism, various religions, and then they established practices. They fought the Chinese, Turks, and outside nations. And through a process of evolution, they led into, they created a system of local wisdom, what we call it. And this presentation is all about the local wisdom and practices. In Pakistan, rather in the Western Himalayas, we have 3 different kind of systems governing the natural resources. The first one is based on the customs. We call it customary laws or riwaj. Riwaj is a local name. Dastur, riwaj, or system. This is a set of rules which the people set for themselves, and with several years of experience, and then those experience was passed through oral transformation, and the communities made it a system for themselves, and is followed. In this, I'm just giving a few examples from this reward. It's about the dominant aspect of this system is the, people in the mountains have like adaptation measures for themselves, predictions. For example, they predict the floods, the disaster from the colors of water, the color of clouds, and Anil mentioned the dogs. Dogs, goats that have been used as a indicator for the floods, disasters, earthquake. It's also about the collective efforts where people gather in a particular village and they have to do some work together for the benefits of the community. And up in the picture, there is a one irrigation channel. If the government has to construct that irrigation channel, it will take years for the government and millions of rupees to construct that one channel. But the community does it in like 3 or 4 weeks, where all the community members comes out, the women and the children are exempted from the work, and they does this work for the community. It's all about the, they have a system for penalties. And like trespass, we have in the government system that the animals passing, a certain area and government issues tickets and things like that. But community has their own system of penalties, social boycotts, and it depends from place to place. But they have developed a very good system where they locally decide that how they should deal with the person who has committed he's done something wrong with the nature. It's also about the, sorry, if I go back, it's also about the relationship of the local people with the environment, and how these people live their life. They start the hunting season, they stop the hunting season with regard to the sun, the rains, and tied up with the crops and things like that. There's hundreds of examples in that particular area which the people practice. The second system we have in the Western Himalaya is the religious practices. And you name the issue, and that has been taken care of in the religion. But I'm just mentioning one point here, that in that part of the world, the cultural practices are really old and much believed as compared to the religious system, because the religion is quite new in that particular area. We have one concept in Islam that is called i'tidal. And i'tidal means that if you use anything, that should be used in a balanced way, which is the modern sustainable use concept. The third system in just like any other government we have in Pakistan is the government has set rules and procedures for, but this system is normally not valued in the local communities, because the community says that it stops them from the use rights and things like that. Now, the issue we have in the Western Himalaya, and I'm sure maybe in other parts of the Himalaya as well, that this indigenous knowledge and these practices, thousands of practices, they're diminishing day by day. This knowledge is, going away. There's no way of documentation, there's no way of recognition, and there is no way of passing it by formally. So I just put these 3 points for urgent need for this, if we can, through, and I'm sure this is also one of the objectives of the project, if that can be taken care of. So I think that will, will survive. Thank you very much.
Maybe you want to come in front, all of you. Well, thank you to all the presenters. I think I'm sure each one of could have gone on and given a lot more, insights, knowledge to us. But I think because of time, nonetheless, they were able to give us enough to work with. A lot of thought-provoking ideas, observations. What we are going to do now is we have asked 2 of my colleagues. First, Cameron Tonkinwise, who is the Associate Dean of Dean for Sustainability at Parsons. He's really a good friend, someone who is known, in my opinion, better as a philosopher who has given serious, thinking on the topic of how do we really rethink, how do we really think about sustainability in general. So he will speak for about 5 minutes, comment, on the presentation, as well as ask, a question or two. And then I'm going to ask Gina Drew to also comment on the presentations, including a question. Then after that, we will open it up, for people to pose their questions and comments. Thank you. Cameron, please.
Thank you, Ashok. And thank you for the opportunity of being here and for having been involved in this project now for 18 months. And it's been an incredible opportunity of learning. And to that extent, I would like to speak and respond in some ways very much from the context that I know, which is much more local, although I speak with an accent, but much more local to this country here. And I would like to just draw attention to some features of what is emerging in relation to sustainability. And to some extent, I'll pick up from Ashok's introduction to say that often in a Western setting, and particularly in a Western setting like a university, one has a strong faith and belief in the power of ideas. That in fact it is ideas and beliefs that lead to change. And so the environmental movement, for example, in America and in Anglo-Australian contexts, spends a lot of time doing consciousness raising. And it marshals, rather pragmatically, somewhat not so sensitively, it marshals whatever discourses it can in order to arrive at a valorization of animals or plants or areas. And it is constantly convincing you that you should be more sustainable because you have discursively come to valorize some particular thing. And so you see lots of alliances forming between religion and environment, for example, where environment will borrow religious understanding in the hope that it causes a valorization of trees and animals and things like that. Unfortunately, this particular approach, after 20 to 30 years of environmental discourse, I hope, though it has not, but by this time we should admit that it is a failure. That in fact we now have an extraordinarily good negative example of the fact that ideas do not cause change. And we now have a sense that in fact people are living everyday lives in a rather different kind of way. We need a more complex and layered understanding of the way people practice everyday lives. And to that extent, I think that is what is so refreshing about this project, that it emphasizes everyday religion with the emphasis very much on the everyday practices as they are lived and the ways in which those practices make use of devices, environments, physical materials and skills which are different from knowledges, attitudes and beliefs. So the way I'm speaking now, in fact, has derived primarily from a British sociologist of technology, a woman called Elizabeth Chauve, who's done a lot of work following on from the French sociologist of technology, Bruno Latour. And very crudely, the model would say that the basic unit of society is a practice, and that a practice involves a thing, a device, some technology. It involves a skill, and it involves a set of meanings. But meanings is only one of three, and there is no change without changing all three. And so the very simple example is that if I'm going to convince you to save more energy, right? Living in New York City right now, I could convince you to save more energy by saying you should change your laundering practices. But you having a valorization of a polar bear and not wanting to cause this polar bear to lose its habitat, it's one thing to have that attitude. It's something very else to translate that rather abstract value into the practice of laundering. And if your washing machine doesn't have a cold setting, it's almost impossible for you to do anything. So the device needs to be changed. And once the device has that capacity, you also then need the know-how and skill to work out how to actually make it happen. And then you somehow need to make that fit with all your other understandings about what is clean, what is healthy, about the way in which you learn to launder, primarily from your mother probably. All these things need to be modified at the same time. And this is why developing sustainable lifestyles is so difficult. Now, I give that little anecdote just by way of saying that I think in a situation like this, it's very important that there be reciprocity in the understanding. This is not a situation of a university in New York attempting to understand practices that are not local. This is a way of understanding also exactly what is local to us now. And so it is poetic and beautiful to think that a hydroelectric system might take the energy from the water. But you will hear nothing so arcane as a lot of the resistance to smart meters being installed into homes right now. So smart metering is very essential for moving to more intelligent distributed energy grids in America. But right now you will see a lot of families saying the electromagnetic radiation is going to kill me, or the government is going to control my air conditioning, or these particular devices are actually going to be tracking my data and not just my electricity. And so this is no more sacred or profane, and this is part of the same practice, that these are the things that we need to modify and change. It's a very complicated process. And so I just offer that as a way of beginning to say that that is what I take from a lot of these presentations from the context I am coming from, which is both more local but also more design-oriented. And so I wonder if any of the speakers can talk about that sort of tripartite attempt to modify how practices happen. The fact that all the examples given show an in-mixing of everyday life. A device, new devices come, the solar charger, for example, but then they also have to have different kinds of meanings. And just merely appealing to meaning does not happen, is not actually going to be an effective source of change.
Great, thank you.
Thank you very much, Cameron. Hello, I'm Georgina Drew. I am the postdoctoral scholar at the India-China Institute. I'm also an anthropologist by training. And many of these presentations, I really spoke to the work that I'm familiar with, the issues that I'm familiar with in the Garhwal Himalayas, where I've worked along just downstream from the melting Gangotri-Gomukh Glacier, which Sanjay ji showed a photo of, and looking at pretty much local perceptions, regional perceptions of change, and changing environments and of climate change, and the ways that people are motivated to respond to a disappearing Ganga because of their faith. And definitely the things that I've seen in the course of that study and thereafter has been that it's not a clear correlation between what their religion says doesn't necessarily motivate them to take part in a river cleaning campaign or a dam opposition campaign. They draw from many different places, and I think that the presentations that we saw have shown all the different places that people are drawing from. I want to thank the speakers for working together to really synthesize all of their perspectives. What we've had over the last 2 days is a process and experience of, we had a meeting yesterday where we talked about some of the everyday religion and sustainable environments in the Himalayas, concepts, themes that we're looking for. And it was a great time to talk about the larger conceptual trends and this gap in scholarship, which we are increasingly seeing, which is that there is a lot of work on religion, institutions of religion, and an assumption that what religions say, the doctrines, the texts say, should correspond to action on the other hand. And we're seeing a very large gap. So it was a great process of kind of everyone bringing a different perspective from a different discipline to the table, and also thinking through the issues that they know very well, and revising them to some extent. So our speakers took it to another step entirely and worked together to put their presentations into a cohesive format, and I thought that worked very well. I thank you for taking that extra effort very much. I want to start with a point that Anil said when he said, he reminded us that the Himalayas, in addition, I think Sanjay also brought this up, in addition to being a very real, physical, and important ecosystem feedback loop, that it's also symbolic. I think that's very important to remember. There's a lot of representations around the world about the Himalayas. I teach a class on ecology in the Himalayas here this semester. Some of my students are here. And, we've been looking at kind of the romanticization of the Himalayas, these double movements of the Himalayas as both pristine, sacred, unchanging, and then also at the same time as being degraded. There was the Himalayan degradation theory in which the lowest of the socioeconomic strata were responsible for devastation of the Himalayas. And linked to that was the idea of the Himalayas and their people as backwards. This has actually created a lot of debate and a lot of challenges and to some extent harm in the way that policies have been constructed vis-a-vis the Himalayas. So when you add into that story climate change, you get an entirely different meta-narrative, as Sanjay said, that is also very powerful and can be dangerous as well when you apply climate change policies without taking into consideration the local context. So I think that's where, everyone else's presentations, Libo, Faiz as well, has really brought to the fore, the value of looking at values, at culture, at meaning, and what that does. It's very critical, and that's why I think that the project that we're working on is so important. And I hope that as it continues, you all participate in some way and be looking at our website and our ongoing conversations and conferences. I think there's a lot to say here, and I think we really do want to turn it over to the audience to have their period for questioning. But I do want to say two things. Well, first, I wanted to thank Cameron for bringing it back to the context here in New York, or at least outside of the Himalayas, and kind of helping us see what these sorts of presentations and perspectives do for people that don't necessarily live in the Himalayas. There has been, there's been campaigns around charismatic creatures like the polar bear, and I think that in some ways the Himalayan glaciers and their disappearance, there's been an effort to make like charismatic glaciers of a certain extent, to make people affectively worried about glaciers disappearing, and it's so remote that it hasn't really inspired a lot of change, nor do people really know what to do. So I thank you for bringing this concept that ideas don't necessarily translate into change, and we need to look at the everyday practices and really why the everyday matters. Which I think is a critical intervention, and definitely one that we are hoping to expand. One thing that I was curious about as I was watching these presentations, we did see a lot about local practices. Again, looking at practices is key, but also local perceptions of the environment and of environmental change to some degree. And there's a little bit of a debate in the literature right now about there's a lot of scholarship that's emerging on local perceptions of climate change, and it's not always clear if it's what's at stake between if the people are seeing environmental change or if they're seeing what they would consider climate change and the practices that they respond to therein. There's a lot of talk about institutions, and there's also in the Himalayas a great deal of institutions that have funding from various sources that are going in and educating people about climate change, educating people about the science of climate change. Up till a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, it was based on predominantly the IPCC's reports and their estimates for climate change. But this is another kind of knowledge that I think we need to look at and really take into consideration. It's new knowledges that are being brought into this, what we're calling a local context. And there's a process of exchange. And how does that exchange look and act on the ground? So I would really like to see if our speakers could talk about the hybrid local knowledges, maybe not, if it's Pakistan, maybe not just drawing from Islam, but something else as well. And then also the hybridities that we see as larger institutions come onto the ground in the Himalayas, wanting to work with communities, bringing knowledge, and the way that people are interacting, internalizing those external knowledges with their own perceptions of either environmental change or climate change, and what kind of effect that has in the region. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cameron and Gina, for adding much needed, dimensions and questions. I think what we should do is first let me ask the 4 presenters to take a few minutes to respond to both the comment and questions that the 2 discussants raised, and then we will open it up. Fortunately, they have been just wonderful. They really stayed within their time frame, and we have enough time to have a good discussion later on. So we'll come to you soon. Please.
I can, just quickly on that issue. So, for example, there's a, very underlying strong value that in a crowd, you should save your own body, but in a drought or in a disaster, you should save seeds, right? So, the popular, those of you who understand Nepali, so hulma biu jogaunu, and anikalma biu jogaunu, right? So, it's a very common thing. But in climate context, when the monsoons are variable, the rains don't arrive on time, it's very easy to get the community rallied around this basic concept to open seed banks. And if you don't open seed banks, you borrow at very high interest rates, and so you spiral into the debt crisis. And so one of the response is seed banks. And so everybody is willing to be part of it. And so those kinds of underlying values basically shortcut your intervention, because the value is already there. And so the idea is not new to them. And so you can, basically do it, very rapidly. So, reducing vulnerability, but based on something that they already adhere to. Could be just one example of doing that, yeah.
Sorry, I finished my presentation earlier because the time given was, it's not about the local practices. It's about the living style of the people. We just mentioned a few practices, but people have all their lives, one or the other way, it's related to the environmental practices. The local knowledge, responding to the Gina point, it's the local wisdom. Let me give you an example. I was conducting a dialogue with the community because my program is entirely based on the community's understanding. We don't take something to them that, hey, you have to do this thing and this thing. In one community, we were conducting studies, and then we asked the community that what is the climate change, how the climate change is viewed in the local perspective. Then a couple of responses came, and one person, he responded that, I know from my experience that for the last 2 years, the butterflies are not showing up here. And this is because of the temperature. Okay. Secondly, some local community people also responded that it might be the cycle. We don't have data in the mountains. We don't know that maybe, like our leader says, that 40 years ago, there was a huge, the season was quite hot and there was a flood, and 40 years later, there's another flood. So maybe it's cyclic changes. The communities are not quite sure that whether the climate change has arrived at the level where the organization are coming and telling them that you have to do it. But certainly there are changes. And I don't think that we can tell them that, okay, that we have is adaptation strategy or mitigation strategy, because that is inbuilt in their own, indigenous structure. For example, I mentioned like some people, when there is any disaster coming, so there are people, experienced people in the communities, they say, okay, there's a bad smell and I think that the flood is going to come. And believe you me, there is flood in a few minutes. They predict the season by the appearance of the birds. They said, okay, this season is and the crop season. They also predict the glacial, and we are saying the glacial are retreating. I don't think the situation is at that worst as presented in the IPCC and as Sanjay mentioned. There are also some practices like glacier breeding. Have anybody heard this particular glacier breeding? And the people have this understanding that if they don't use some particular areas where used to be glacier or where there is snow, they bring snow from other areas and with their own understanding grafted there. And in the next season, there's a huge snow up there. They have also some practices for the water storage. They know that this third year is a drought year for them. and they, they store the water exactly. So as I believe that it's very much immature that we say that climate change is being right in the Himalaya at the level where they say. But I think if coming again to the last point of my presentation, if we recognize the local knowledge and listen to them and channelize that knowledge into the scientific channel, so I think that will work. Thank you.
I think I don't have a answer to questions that you have raised. Largely, in the last 15 or some years, I have seen so many environment challenges that are happening in the designed community or highly designed spaces. I guess I just feel very pessimistic about the whole thing. As you said, for individual people to change their behavior is already very challenging. But the way we designed our society is even more difficult. No matter how skillful, how willing we want to mimic the nature, but the way we designed the society is pretty problematic. For instance, in Beijing, just one example, the way we cemented, the way we feel, the cleanness of the space, we cemented everywhere, so that we stopped the groundwater from, going to the ground, and that stops how the water table of the whole city, and it really messes up how the vegetation's distribution of the cities. We just get more and more complicated. We generate more and more knowledge. Our understanding of ecosystem can be from micro to macro, and we have design schools like Parsons. We try to be very conscious, but still, the design community are really getting into big troubles. Simple things like here in the States, I did my graduate study here. One thing that I don't understand is the way of life. In the winter, like when I was at Cornell, it snowed very hard in the winter. People dress very thick and enter into the building, and then immediately they change to T-shirts. And in the summer, you go into the building, and you immediately have to put up more clothes. What is this? You try to act, against the weather. It's so difficult.
Well, thank you. I quite agree with Cameron that ideas, do not cause change. I would like to add a word, that is, ideas alone do not cause a change. Because I think in the peripheries and the margins, ideas do matter a lot. Having said that, I think what is interesting in the context of climate change is this interplay between the material and the ideational, and how this interplay then is reflected in everyday behavior and practices. Because if we look at these communities and their localities and their locations, I think it is possible to argue that geography still matters, and matters a lot. And for many communities, worldviews really matter. Having said that, I think the sacred is fixed neither in time and space. The problem, I think, is that in many parts of Himalayas, particularly central Himalayas, Garhwal, from where I gave examples, there has been very little research on mapping the changing nature of sacred, and how the ideas of sacredness then are translated, into everyday behavior. Coming to your point, I think a very critical point. I agree with the hybridity point that you are making, but we also see that there is a resistance from local traditions if external institutions try to displace them. I think there is also the whole issue of the politics of language. Many of the issues which are on the agenda of climate change today are not new issues. These issues have been there for a very, very long time on the agenda of sustainable development. I'm not talking about the sustainable development concept by the time it travels to Rio. It has been co-opted. It ceases to be a normative ethical principle. So I think in Himalayas, there is a very interesting situation, which is that communities in many parts of Himalayas have already been subjected to deeply entrenched ecological irrationalities, which probably have traveled from other parts of China to Chinese Himalayas or from India to quote-unquote Indian Himalayas. I think the challenge, in my view, would be how does one make these new logics and new languages understandable to the communities concerned? Otherwise, for them, if climate change makes your plight more visible to the international community, they welcome it, right? So, thanks.
Thank you. Let's see.
Yes. Yeah, I always do. Thank you, Richard Jordan. Thanks to all the presenters. And alaikum wassalam to Faiz, who said to us as salam alaikum. We just didn't respond. Richard Jordan, I chaired a large conference for 2,000 NGOs on climate change at the UN in 2007. Before I ask Sanjay a question, just a comment to Cameron. My Episcopal church used to have a washer and dryer that ran on a quarter each. So when I laundered the vestments each week, I did my own laundry. So if I can do it, everybody else can piggyback on your church or house of worship. Just do your laundry with the vestments. To Sanjay, I heard about this reforestation program about 15 years ago, but it was explained not in terms of replenishing the forest, but in replenishing or restoring the myth of how rainwater comes to the earth. Is that correct? Is that how that was actually done, not as a reforestation project, but as a replenishing the myth as well? Thank you.
It's kind of a question, comment. Salam alaikum, namaste. Cameron, your ideas don't create change. Well, that's a technicality, right? If ideas equal thoughts and thoughts can generate energy, then certainly energy can affect change, right? We all know, everyone sitting here, academic or otherwise, we would all agree, I think, that corporate greed is responsible for devastating the environment, the economies of the world, and the educational sectors of the world, and so on. In view of that, particularly because my special love and attention has gone to Nepal for many years, I'd like to mention to Anil, when you showed the picture of the goat being slaughtered, there has been significant change in this department, and it's certainly questionable to me that if everybody stopped killing goats in Nepal tomorrow, whether there would be an influx of goats roaming around with no home, nor any place to go, nor anything to eat. Because then the United States would have to say the same thing. If they stopped killing everything in the United States right now, then all the cows, lambs, chickens, and so on would be without homes, and then we would have to euthanize all of them. I think there are very simple ways to live ethically, whether it's in New York or whether it's in Kathmandu or in the villages of Nepal, China, and elsewhere. I think my question is, for instance, in places where education is just not acceptable, along with the water, the clean water, and everything else that they need, education is also not accessible. So these ingrained habits that come from what you're calling regional or local religions, I think all of that's being examined by the people and the offsprings of all of these people living in villages everywhere in the world, because they're gaining access to education, and they are also seeing, and I know this for a fact in terms of Nepal, they are seeing that, killing animals is not really the most ethical thing to do to get food. Now, in this room right now, we all used a fork to get our cheese, right? How many people in this room are taking home their fork? Raise your hand. No? But that's... Otherwise, we have to recycle it, and that whole recycling thing is going to use up so much water and chemicals and God knows what else, right? So right here, you mentioned how difficult it was to make changes. That's the part. I think not, I wouldn't use the word difficult, I would say slow. It may be slow to make changes. I could tell a Nepali person not to put sugar in their tea for 15 years, and then maybe in the 16th year they'll use stevia. Maybe. But I understand. That's a comment. I didn't really ask a question. The question I asked regarding religion, I didn't see that much of the religious aspect comes through here, as much as questions surrounding that many faceted aspects of life as we know it everywhere. But in terms of religion, would you all agree that religious ethics is starting to become a little bit more enlightening to newer generations?
Thank you. I think that's...
Sorry for such a long one.
Anyone wants to respond to Sanjay, maybe you want to expand a bit on...
Thank you very much for having raised this very important question. I think it was both. It was a very strategic... all right. It was a very strategic deployment of certain Hindu, I will emphasize on that, Hindu myths, Hindu symbols. And this was also a time when in the country at large, you had a significant assertion of Hindu cultural nationalism. And this particular project was hailed all over in different parts of the world, I think including United States. And it was argued that, look, this project shows that there is no major contradiction between science and religion, that the two can be fruitfully brought together. So the way in which all these myths were brought back, the way in which they were then combined with scientific discourses itself, I think, in my view, was very, very interesting. But I think that this kind of discourse and the consequences of the discourse, howsoever positive they might appear to be, have certain limitations. Because these discourses can also alienate other communities which do not believe in these Hindu myths and Hindu symbolism. So I think it was both. I will fully agree with you that was being done. I think coming to your religious ethics is becoming, I think that statement is interesting, but I think everyday religion can also be differentiated from the religions of the books in the sense that many of these practices, which we dub as religious practices, under the category called sacred, are not religious. I think there's a good deal of scholarship to show that when people worship nature or certain communities worship certain deities, their understanding of religion and religious ethics is different. So I would much rather, pitch on that kind of an argument. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Luna Ranjit, and I really thank all the panelists for the presentation. I was born and raised in Nepal, and now I live in New York, so the conversation is something that I think about a lot. And all the panelists, you're working in the Himalayas, based out of there, but as Cameron touched on it, it's like how to bring it here. And also what many of you noted, that what happens, they're not isolated. What happens here in New York is affecting what's happening there. And I just read an article today, which I found it quite disturbing, that less than half of Americans now believe in climate change, and that the number has gone from being up to 71% to now like in the 40s. And so, like, you know, what do you think about that? And like, you know, what do you think needs to happen? Like, given that the focus has been on educating the villagers to plant trees and save like the glaciers, whereas like, you know, what we're doing here, and here in New York or like in any of the developed nations, like we're so disconnected from the nature. We don't see the cycles. We don't see the butterflies except in the zoos, and so we don't notice those things. So how do we bring change here? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your actually really wonderful presentations. I wanted to follow up from the really very fundamental discussion around the everyday and some things that Cameron alluded to. I've thought for a long time, because I did my own research actually on riots after the riots in Bombay, and have been thinking very much about the construction of them, both as religious and the more economic, socioeconomic readings of them. And one of the things that has always struck me in thinking about religion in relationship to anything else, which I think all of you allude to in very wonderful ways, is the place of common sense. Things that are not necessarily held as very profound beliefs, but things that we sort of take for granted. They just seem commonsensical. It goes to your statement, Libo, about being in Cornell and just saying, it just seems silly, right, to come into a library in the summer and have to put on a shawl. There's something just inherently non-commonsensical about it. And that's a very difficult place and quite different from the place of value and religion in the way in which you have to approach the ways in which people might change their behavior. Because when, in doing a lot of fieldwork research in Bombay and trying to imagine what people think about others, whether they're Muslim or Hindu or others, the explanations people give are very everyday and ordinary. They don't have bartans like, they don't use the same kinds of vessels like we do. The sense of differentiation and the way in which you see a word translates into very commonsensical practices. And so I'm curious and interested about the place of common sense, which is a little different from everyday religion, but lives in the same sort of realm of the hybrid cultural that Gina was referring to.
I just want to respond to one question, and it's very, I've been considered myself as a community member because I'm there for the last 17 years. We all the time we are saying, educate the local people, educate the villagers. What do you call education? I'm just asking you a question. Education with regard to living in the environment, education with regard to using the trees, the medicinal plants, the water. They know it. But think about for yourself that you are living in -15 for 6 months. Okay? You don't have central heating system. You don't have access to the market. You don't have employment. You don't have crops because the crop is a single cropping zone only for 3 months, and sometimes most of the time doesn't mature because. So what are you going to do? Am I asking him not to graze your goat in the pasture? Am I asking him not to cut a tree to keep yourself warm? They know it, but they don't have alternatives. We're sitting in New York and Islamabad and somewhere wearing a coat, having a cup of like 50 coffees a day and saying, okay, they're not educated. This is a wrong perception. I was conducting an exercise with the local communities since I'm a wildlife biologist by profession. And I was talking yesterday with my friend that we were asking the communities that why the horns of one animal in the same population is shorter or thinner than the other one. And I got 5 different answers. Everyone was right. One was saying, our animals, they are here up at this side of the river, so when they don't cross the river, so something happens and their horns remain shorter. The other question was, the other response was, you know, there's a clutch size of 2 or 1. So the year when the clutch size is 2, so each of the animal kid is not getting the equal chances of feeding. So the heart, and several. What I'm saying, this is a wrong perception that local people don't understand. They understand, but they don't have opportunities. They don't have resources. So instead of telling them to fix themselves, we need to fix ourselves. This is the question, this response I'm giving to the question. Thank you.
This is the beginning of a journey. So I hope I can go into the communities. Previously, I was very familiar with them, but I was paying more attention on like rangeland conservation, forest conservation. But now I'm going to go to ask them the meaning of the religion and why they do things this way or that way and how they changes. I'd like to comment on your suggestion of differentiation. When you see people are moving from a rather scattered space to a more concentrated space. Previously, they will study the sun and they will decide how a building should be located, sited, so that they might, face the sun. And there are a lot of codified culture. They have to have the house facing the certain ways. But it's actually ecologically sound. But when they are moving into a more concentrated space, they might lose that because it's a cemented house, it's bricks, and it has a totally different idea of insulation. They actually end up living in a colder space. And how they heat the space, whether they can trade a cemented pillow as a sacred pillow, whereas before they used wood to build it, and there is one place they call it sacred pillow. But now that pillow cemented, is it still sacred? How do they, the common sense is transferred, and it definitely had this collision with religious practice or everyday cultural practices. I can't answer that, but I would like to find out.
Hello. My question is actually sort of connected to Luna's. My name is Muna, by the way. This question of disconnection, and it's interesting because you spoke of this initiative as being from the peripheries and not Beijing, Kathmandu, Islamabad, Delhi-centered, and I can only speak of Kathmandu. But talking about this disconnection and knowing that Kathmandu is a place with everyday people and everyday religion and the sacred and this large development that's been going on in terms of microbuses, whatever have you. Every year I go back, that's doubled in numbers. And maybe Anilji, you can speak to it. But what can Kathmandu-basi do? And how can we, like Faiz said, educate ourselves? Would it involve a project like Libo's about the pictures, this poignant project of pictures putting together and realizing that, yes, these are periphery, central, what have you, but we are all sort of working for the same environment or Himalayan environment? I know this is a large, almost philosophical question, but it's one that we could talk about.
Yeah, sorry. My name is Prakash Shrestha. I am the PhD candidate at the New School. And yeah, very interesting presentation. I like presentation. And global warming, climate change is now major issue, no doubt. And I have the two questions to the panel as a whole. And the first question is that what are the solutions? Could you list the three important solutions to us from your research or from your experience? And the second question is that you are looking the religion and climate change, and how feasible is it? Just ignoring the livelihood, economic activity for their survival. I think the economic livelihood also very important to have the impact on the climate change. Thank you.
Maybe we'll take one more, I think.
Thank you very much for your presentations. My name is Tobias Reed. I'm working for the Maldivian, the Republic of Maldives, and their UN presentation here. Well, next week I'm going to Durban to the COP conference, and obviously, like international climate negotiations is completely different from local actions and everyday religious practice and how that affects local communities. And so unfortunately, I do not have, on a day-to-day basis, contact with that issue. And so my question would be, how do those local actions or local initiatives affect people who do not live in the Himalaya, but who live down the river, who live in the big cities, who live maybe in southern India? So basically, this local wisdom, and Faiz Ali Khan, you talked about also that there's a very high level of education in those villages. How does that basically translate into education about environment or climate change within the cities? And especially from my point of view, that would be interesting. How does it translate into education and wisdom within the elites who unfortunately usually are represented in the international relations and diplomacy? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Karthik. I'm a master's economics student at the New School for Social Research. My background was in civil engineering and my focus was on climate change, so this was a very fascinating presentation for me. I just have a comment and a quick question. This is actually with reference to what Libo said about the Cornell and the air conditioning systems and how you put on clothes in the summer and take clothes off in the winters. So what when the green building when green buildings first came into India, the LEED rating system was verbatim copied from the US rating system. And what they did was they said that if you wanted a platinum rating for your building in India, you would have to necessarily have a HVAC system in your building. This kind of was a pretty retarded concept in the sense that, so if you come from a city where, I come from a city, Mysore, where it's hot 2 months out of the year. There is absolutely no requirement for an air conditioning system there. But just because I want a green platinum rating, I need to take my energy footprint up by a factor of 3, then make it 10% efficient to get the rating. It just doesn't make sense. And in my opinion, again, I'm still studying these things, but in my opinion, it seems that we've more focused on absolute outcomes and absolute measures rather than relative measures. That seems to be a big problem. And just in case anybody's interested, this actually was picked up by the Green Building Commission, and they did rectify it in a future version of the draft. The question that I had was, and this moves away from the Himalayas, but it deals with religion and ecology. If the Ram Setu project, for those who don't know about the Ram Setu project, it's supposed to be from Rameshwaram in South India to Sri Lanka. The Ramayana, the story of Ram, goes that a bridge was constructed, and he used that bridge to go and rescue Sita. And today, I think the Western world calls it Adam's Bridge. And it is ecologically, I mean, an ecologist would tell you that it is a shoal formation of some kind. I don't have the specifics with me, but it's pretty ancient and it's very unique. There is a proposal right now to dredge that project and to create a sea channel or whatever, a channel for ships to pass through. So what the Hindu various movements did was say that that is Rama's bridge. It's got a religious significance and you cannot destroy it. Unfortunately, what happened also was it went to a point, and there was a big debate, and it went to a point where Manmohan Singh, the Prime Minister, went on record saying Rama who? And it went to the court where they actually had a debate on whether Ramayana is real and whether the story is real and so on. So my question is, all of this happens because there's a growing movement away from the religious principles. There's a growing rationalization process that's occurring. And all these, the common sense ideas are changing, value systems are changing. How do you address those issues in the Himalayas where I presume that those changes would occur there too?
Let's take the last question, Arjun. And then we will see.
My name is Arjun Gurung, and I'm from Nepal. I would like to relate my own experience, while growing up in Nepal, in the mountains of Nepal, and this whole recognition to the local wisdom and local knowledge. While growing up, how our grandparents and people in our village used to really do things that was completely sort of destroyed by this intervention when an agricultural research center was established in our village. Nowadays, nobody really raise herds of buffaloes or cows because they all now rely on urea fertilizer to really do things in their lands, and how that has destroyed our land and the producers that come from there. So it's really refreshing and really exciting for someone like me. And by the way, my field is technology, IT. I don't know anything about all the things that you guys are doing, but just to relate to my own thing, it's so refreshing that the approach that you are talking about, is that something that the development community, INGO and such, are now finally coming to realize and learning, and there is now some hope that things will really happen in a way that makes sense to the local communities and recognizing those. So that's my one thing. And other question that I have for Fayaz, maybe it's a very obvious question. On your slides, especially on the pictures, I did not see any women. Is that like by omission of pictures? They were women? No, in Fayaz. I'm talking about Fayaz. Or is like, women really don't participate? I'm just being curious. Okay, thank you.
Anyway, yeah. You can explain. It's all right.
Why don't you do that one?
Yeah, you don't need to.
Okay, so let me just quickly, it's not just Kathmandu specific, it's not just Nepal specific, but just as a background. So 10 years of armed conflict, and the population of Kathmandu, like no other city in the world, it grew at 12% per annum. Now, I don't know anywhere in the world, where a city infrastructure can keep up with, that kind of movement. But for the past 3 years, because of the peace process, people have been going, out. And you'll be really surprised, like this is the third year that people have been able to go back to the villages. And so the latest census, which actually shows that people are now going back. And so, the kind of pressure that we see. So I think peace building, constitution, all these become part of, the natural resource, management as well. But also, just to say, sometimes, we tend to look at just negativity or, sort of the bad things stand out. But again, just look at a country like Nepal, which has been able to bring down poverty, from 41%, down to about 25%. And in pockets, it's actually as low as 12, 13%. But even look at mortality rates, right? Infant mortality rate. The population growth rate of Nepal has gone in 2 decades from 2.6%, and then 10 years later, 2.1%, and now the latest census shows 1.4%. So how many countries in the world, despite all these challenges, can achieve, these things? So I think there is hope, but just on this approach that we're talking, so like in Kathmandu Valley, we're able to save the watershed that supplies fresh water to Kathmandu because of the sacredness of the source of the Bagmati River, right? So it's very difficult to save the other watersheds. So if you look at, the sacred forests in Kathmandu, they're all saved. Pashupati, Swayambhu, Bajrabarai. The wetlands in Kathmandu, they're all saved because of the myth or the belief in the Nagas. So I think, it is, you have to look at the big picture of what's happening, but then you can also do all these small things that are embedded in people's values. So I would just say, we just constantly have to look at the big picture and also work on the small picture as well.
Just respond to your question. We don't have any click button mechanism to resolve the issues and educate them or the people here up here. But I just want to give you a few points. I've been to the COPs 4-5 times, and even in Durban, I believe that this time they'll recognize the community-based approaches as part of the main course. But then, to my knowledge, they have been recognized yet, and they're just sitting in the Taba outside. So the first thing is to recognize the value of the local communities and the local knowledge we have. The second thing is that we also need to document it. There's no documentation. I'm living in the mountains, and if I don't use allopathic medicines myself, okay. There's a lot of a range of plants, and when you have any problems, you go to the community member and they give you a plant, and you are fine in a week or so. This is local knowledge, needs documentation. I'll also give you one example from Nepal. We were talking about the forest conservation. We have been spending billions of dollars elsewhere, but the forest is not conserved yet. But if you think of the Nepal community forestry, because the community is implementing that project themselves, we need to give them a chance to implement the projects. Why an outsider organization like myself or yourself go with a bunch of money and management plan and give it to the community? They'll certainly take it because they know something is coming. But I know that what they feel and what they discuss with the NGOs or the representative of the organization goes back. So the point is that if we put them in the driving seat and experience their knowledge and their practices, and I'm sure, I'm not saying that everything will be resolved, but that will be much better than the one we just take it from outside. Thank you.
I want to respond to this sense of traditional or the community's values or religious activities are too small, and the COP's discussion, the climate change, are too strong. I must say I feel very similar. I attended 2 COP's meeting in Copenhagen and Mexico Cancun meeting. I think there is a sense of failure in me that the scientific knowledge system is really such that failed to recognize the whole holistic picture of the world. We somehow, this need to be corrected, but the challenge is very big. Give you an example. In China, the traditional medicine, Chinese traditional medicine, is really losing out. You know why? The reason? Because according to the scientific knowledge system, you need to quantify everything. Whereas traditional knowledge, there are a lot of experiential learning that pass from generation to generation, from individual to individual, and it's very difficult to quantify and make it logical. So, Western scientific knowledge is really something that you need to defer something that is logical, that can be taught to the mass. And also, when you mix several medicine together, you don't actually know which of the compound is actually functioning. But in the Western medicine, you need to make sure, you need to say that. So the global trade, Chinese government or Chinese trade bureau wants to, trade Chinese medicine, and it's blocked. So they were saying, okay, we need to quantify everything. And that's when the problem occurs, because it almost like you need to have banana talks to apple, but the way to do it is to ask apple to talk the language apple talks, and there is no real hybrid. But I believe there are a lot of value or system that can look at this, have a more holistic picture, but we don't have that yet. So there might be there are so many climate change discussions happening, and I've attended a few, but I really feel a lot of those meetings don't result anything that is beneficial to all parties. We have to fight that battle. It's not easy, but...
Well, thank you. I would like to briefly respond to some of the issues raised on climate change, starting with the very last one, which is the Ram Setu bridge project. I think your intervention raises the very important question of the uses and abuses of sacred. So far we have talked about the uses, and the good uses to which the notion of sacred can be put, for climate change mitigation and adaptation. But here is a case where you find that the very concept of sacred being hijacked by a particular iconography of Hindutva, where strategic becomes sacred. The reasons for that bridge are strategic, expressed, in terms of a particular imagination and vocabulary. Going to, the earlier issues raised, what should we do if we have to really address the issue of climate change? My response would be that, first of all, there is a need to bridge the gap between scientific understanding of climate change and cultural understanding of climate change. And I think this is what the Lewis Foundation project is trying to achieve, and this is what we are trying to really do, that bridge that gap. Secondly, I think it's very important to do more research and avoid the trap of consensus discourse, because I think there is a need for much more serious and systematic research on climate change, because there's a very complex spatial geography to it. I would also say that avoid the danger of climate change becoming a common sense, because I think the problem with common sense can be sometimes that a particular hegemonic discourse tries to become a part of common sense. And I think what climate change mitigation adaptation would require is not so much the common sense, but common consciousness. An imagination of a new scale altogether. Conventional scale is not going to work. Scholars have now started talking about Anthropocene scale, which is very different from the earlier conventional scales, and new understandings of territory, sovereignty, and security, which is not happening. So if you look at climate change as a deterritorialized challenge, which it is, most of the responses that have come so far are very territorialized responses. You're talking about national carbon sinks. India and China continue to face the dilemma, because both these countries, particularly in India, we have the revolution of rising expectations, and therefore the entire discourse becomes very, very development-centric. But finally, I would say that it's important to look at climate change also as an opportunity, opportunity to rethink the entire paradigm of development. Because at the end of the day, the question is, can billions in the global south develop the way in which millions in the global north have developed so far? So I think these are some of the issues. And finally, I would say it is much more useful to look at climate change challenge from the perspective of human security and human rights issue. We need a very critical, ethical, normative engagement with the whole issue, because the danger, in my view, is that the entire climate change is becoming a shadow boxing. It's becoming a site of shadow boxing. And in many cases, it is simply hijacked by the discourses or paradigm of national security. Thank you. And one my last point is that I think everyday religions should also be seen as the sites of resistance. It's not simply because many of these resistance are against these, religious meta-narratives, which are politically motivated and politically driven. Thank you very much.
Well, I just want to thank everyone for contributing to the questions and to the discussion. It was very useful. I think I'm going to echo some of the panelists, particularly Libo and Sanjay, in saying, it seems like there's two different versions of common sense that we're talking about, which I think was a really great intervention. There's one level of common sense, which is, Gramsci talks about, the hegemony of common sense actually being a way, rule of power. I think we have feedback. A way to make people accept systems of rule that they also, as Foucault said, internalize and then self-regulate. We see that happening with the logics of with neoliberal economics and this default solution that we should be commoditizing the air and the water and everything else because it all fits within a market model. So I think that that's a really great reminder to always question that level of common sense. But what the panelists are also bringing to the table, which I really appreciate and which I think is so fundamental, is this other level of common sense, which is, why do people revere water? Well, it's very connected to life, to survival, and to many of the things that make living possible. So, that's also something that we can regain and reclaim and use to kind of more create a balance as we move forward and think about, mitigating a lot of these challenges that we face. Thank you very much, everyone.
Okay, I think we are 5 minutes past the time. So I just want to again, thank all the panelists. And want to again, thank the audience here and remind you that stay tuned, and we will have more conversations around this. It's clear that these issues are complex. We are not saying that you forget the economics, you forget the scientific knowledge. We are just only thing we are saying is the world is a lot more complex place. If you're talking about climate change, if you're talking about Himalaya, you need to look at many dimensions. And if you look at the discourse that's taking place around all of this, the idea of people, culture, different meanings associated with diverse viewpoints, being factored in, you see very little of that is taking place. For that reason, I think our project is really an attempt to both, increase our understanding, build alliances, and have an interdisciplinary dialogue, transnational conversation. And for that, I think we are grateful to Luz Foundation that is supporting this initiative. I'm grateful to my colleagues, both at the New School and outside of New School, who have joined in this very interesting exercise. And I hope, we will have more of these conversations in the future. But if you want to know what kind of conversations we're having in India, China, Nepal, you could, visit our website. A lot of information will be posted there as well. So thank you again for coming.